I had just sat down at the terrace of a cafe on the Avenue du Bois de Boulogne and was enjoying an iced orangeade. Suddenly I was shaken with surprise on seeing an airship come right down in front of me. The guide rope coiled around the legs of my chair and Monsieur Santos-Dumont got out. He then called for an aperitif, drank it down, got on board his airship again and went gliding off into space. I'm glad that with my own eyes, I have been able to contemplate the Birdman. So did the writer André Fagel describe an encounter with the pioneering aviator Alberto Santos-Dumont. The novelty of this quickly wore off for Monsieur Fagel, as he and hundreds of other Parisians would experience many such moments with Alberto, whose little No. 9 airship was specifically designed to replace his car and act as a runabout around the city. Alberto would take off and land No. 9 directly from outside his house on the fashionable Rue Washington, just off the Champs-Élysées, and pootle around in the skies over Paris, going on jaunts to the countryside, and frequently mooring up for lunch at his favourite restaurant, Le Cascade, where Monsieur Fagel had his orangeade so dramatically disturbed. Eventually, the police got involved, instructing Alberto to avoid landing on the Champs-Élysées for fear he would cause traffic jams. Such japes were typical of Alberto Santos-Dumont's colourful and eventful career. But don't be fooled by the lightheartedness. Alberto was a deadly serious pioneer, a fearless pilot, a highly capable and resourceful engineer who significantly advanced the science and art of aviation, both with his airships and with his aeroplanes. The first person in Europe to fly an aeroplane, his name is cruelly lost on the continent these days, although he remains, quite rightly, a national hero in Brazil. His story is fascinating. It's a story of courage and obsession, and of the toll such obsession can take on a person. It's a window into Paris at the turn of the century, with all its glamour, frivolity, and excess. But I think ultimately, the story of Alberto Santos-Dumont is the story of a clash between different visions of the future of aviation, with Alberto's peaceful, playful, almost utopian dream meeting a far more hard-nosed, businesslike, humourless approach to flying. The story of Alberto Santos-Dumont is, in many ways, one of how aviation grew up. Welcome to Upship, the Airship History Podcast, and thank you as ever for listening. I'm Nick Rogers, your captain on this long-haul flight through the fascinating history of airships. Last episode, we traced the early history of airships, joining men such as Henri Giffard and David Schwartz as they attempted to solve the problem of how to turn lighter-than-air flight from an amusing distraction into something that could actually be useful to humankind. Now we turn to the life and work of one of aviation's most interesting characters, the Brazilian pioneer Alberto Santos-Dumont. Alberto's experiments with airships and early aeroplanes turned him into one of the most famous men in the world, as the stories of his escapades became legends in his own lifetime. Despite assiduously cultivating his image with his impeccable dress, eye-catching antics, and his willingness to pick up the check for dinner, Alberto was also paradoxically a quiet, rather shy man. He was the dreamer of beautiful dreams, while also having the talent and wealth to make those dreams come true. I found his story so interesting and his achievements so varied, I couldn't possibly condense them all into one episode, so you have the treat of 2 episodes about this groundbreaking aviator. My main source was My Airships by Alberto himself. I also drew on Wings of Madness by Paul Hoffman and Man Flies, the story of Alberto Santos-Dumont by Nancy Winters. Before we get into the details of the episode, I'd like to draw listeners' attention to the TEDx talk I gave to TEDx Kingston-upon-Thames back in January. The video of the talk has recently gone onto YouTube and has now attracted over 21,000 views. I talk about where my passion for airships came from, why we no longer have large airships in our skies, and why that matters. Do check it out and let me know what you think. Remember too to check out the bonus episode released last week in which I interviewed Thibaut Prou, an airship engineer and a long-term employee of the French company Flying Whales, which is in the vanguard of efforts to bring large airships back into regular use. Back now to Alberto Santos-Dumont, whose story begins not in Paris, where he became famous, but in Brazil. Alberto was born in a remote region of Brazil, north of Rio de Janeiro, the sixth child of French-educated engineer Henrique Dumont and his aristocratic wife, Francesca de Paula Santos. Henrique was building part of a railway through the state on behalf of the Emperor Dom Pedro II, and Alberto spent his 6 years living in the family's incredibly isolated house near the project, which is now a museum to Alberto and his achievements. Once the railway was complete, Henrique turned his engineering hand and his wife's fortune to the coffee business. Paul Hoffman in Wings of Madness tells us how Henrique cleared a vast tract of land near Sao Paulo, planted 5 million coffee trees, and set up the highly advanced technology required to cultivate, harvest, and process the coffee beans, including an extensive railway to haul the beans across the vast expanse of the farm. The plantation generated huge amounts of income for Henrique and his family. As a boy, Alberto was captivated by all this engineering and machinery. In his autobiography, he describes how formative an experience it was. "I can hardly imagine a more stimulating environment for a boy. At the age of 7, I was permitted to drive our locomobiles of the epoch, steam traction engines of the fields with great broad wheels. At the age of 12, I had conquered my place in the cabs of the Baldwin locomotive engines, hauling trainloads of green coffee over the 60 miles of our plantation railway. When my father and brothers would take pleasure in making horseback trips near and far to see if the trees were clear, if the crops were coming up, and if the rains had done damage, I preferred to slip down to the works and play with the coffee engines." It seems to have been an idyllic boyhood, much of it spent indulging in fantasies of flying, which were inspired by depictions of ballooning in novels by Jules Verne, and also by reports of balloon and airship developments in his father's engineering journals. He was captivated and managed to create his own hot air balloons out of tissue paper, describing how each year, on June 24th, over the St. John bonfires, which are customary in Brazil from long tradition, I inflated whole fleets of these little montgolfiers and watched in ecstasy their ascension to the skies. He and his friends would play a game called Pigeon Flies. They'd gather in a circle and the leader would call out pigeon flies, hen flies, crow flies, bee flies, and so on. At each call, the other children raised their fingers if the phrase was correct. But sometimes the leader would throw a curveball, dog flies, for example, and those who inadvertently raised their fingers would pay a forfeit. And I think I'm going to turn this into a drinking game. Sometimes the leader would call out man flies, and young Alberto would make a point of very deliberately raising his finger, much to the mockery of his friends. He saw his first balloon aged 15 at a fair in Sao Paulo. It only increased his desire for flight, and he later wrote, "I too desired to go ballooning. In the long sun-baked Brazilian afternoons, where the hum of insects, punctuated by the far-off cry of some bird, lulled me, I would lie in the shade of the veranda and gaze into the fair sky of Brazil, where the birds fly so high and soar with such ease on their great outstretched wings, where the clouds mount so gaily in the pure light of day, and you have only to raise your eyes to fall in love with space and freedom." So musing on the exploration of the aerial ocean, I too devised airships and flying machines in my imagination. This glorious idyll was rudely shattered when Alberto's father was thrown from his horse, suffering severe injuries and partial paralysis. Henrique's focus now became finding medical treatment, and his thoughts turned to the city of his education, one which was leading the world in medical technology. He sold the coffee plantation and travelled with his wife and his sixth child across the Atlantic to Paris. Alberto Santos-Dumont was 18, and his life was about to change forever. Paris in 1891 was the city of the newly constructed Eiffel Tower, of the braggadocio of the Paris Exposition for which the tower was built, a city of railways and motorcars and balloons. a city trying to forget the siege of Paris just 20 years ago, and, as discussed on my last podcast episode, a seminal moment for balloons in conflict. It was the perfect city, then, for a young man fascinated by engineering. Discovering that, to his amazement and disappointment, very little progress had been made since Henri Giffard's flight in 1852, and being quoted outrageous prices for a balloon flight, Alberto turned to the automobile for his mechanical kicks. He travelled all the way to Valentigney on the French-Swiss border to buy a 3.5 horsepower Peugeot, which he drove around the streets of Paris, being forbidden by the authorities from parking in public places for fear of causing a commotion, such was the novelty of this new form of transport. At this point in his life, Alberto shuttled back and forth a few times between Paris and Brazil as his father's health worsened. Henrique, who I think sounds like a very decent man, advanced Alberto his inheritance so he could go out into the world and follow his passions. Henrique died in 1892, and Alberto embarked on several years of adventure, travelling and education. He climbed Mont Blanc, visited England and the United States, and engaged a tutor to help him with his scientific and technical training. All the while he was collecting and driving cars, but he had yet to achieve his dream of flight. Settling in Paris, finally in 1897, he read about Solomon André's doomed, heroic, and ultimately fatal attempts to reach the North Pole by balloon. But what really caught his eye was the fact that the construction of the balloon, which was pretty big and highly advanced, cost far less than he would have imagined. He looked up the balloon's builders, Messieurs Lachambre and Moucheron, who offered to take him on his first ever flight. It was to be a formative experience, and one which confirmed to him his dream to fly. He describes the sensation. Suddenly, the wind ceased. The air seemed motionless around us. We were off, going at the speed of the air current in which we now lived and moved. Indeed, for us there was no more wind, and this is the first great fact of all spherical ballooning. Infinitely gentle is this unfelt movement forward and upward. The illusion is complete. It seems not to be the balloon that moved, but the earth that sinks down and away. Alberto was always something of a gourmand, enjoying the finer things in life. For this flight, he packed a splendid lunch of hard-boiled eggs, cold roast beef and chicken, cheese, ice cream, fruits and cakes, champagne, coffee, and chartreuse. Nothing, he said, is more delicious than lunching like this above the clouds. Certainly beats airline food. It was an eventful flight. They were aloft for almost 2 hours, flew through thick fog, and got their guide rope tangled up in a tree before landing safely and packing the balloon and basket onto a train, back in Paris by 6:30 that evening. Alberto was hooked, and almost instantly placed an order for a balloon of his own design with Lachambre and Moucheron. In what was to become typical for him, his design challenged conventional thinking. Far smaller than standard, and to be made of non-standard Japanese silk, the experienced balloonists tried to prove to Alberto that it was an impossible design. How often have things been proved to me impossible, he wrote. Now I'm used to it, I expect it. But in those days, it troubled me. Still, I persevered. Indeed he did, and the balloon was built. The varnished Japanese silk envelope proved lightweight, gas-tight, and robust, and Alberto was to use the same material for future airships. By the time of his balloon's first ascent on the 4th of July 1898, now named the Brazil, Alberto had become an experienced balloonist under Lachambre's instruction. It was a successful ascent, but only served to whet Alberto's appetite. In his autobiography, he recalls the moment during his very first flight when they were stuck on the tree at the mercy of the wind. Monsieur Moucheron took the opportunity to try and teach Alberto a lesson and warn him off pursuing so-called steerable balloons, asking him how any propeller could stand up to the power of the wind. As ever, Alberto refused to succumb to received wisdom. But he faced the same problem that we saw other pioneers grappling with in the previous episode: how to find a power plant that was light enough to be carried aloft, but with enough power to propel the aircraft against the wind. He discounted all other attempts made so far. Giffard's steam engine was too heavy, underpowered, and dangerous. Electric motors were also too heavy and underpowered. Alberto, the motoring enthusiast, was greatly taken with the small internal combustion engine he had on his motorized tricycle. Working in secret with a hired mechanic, he set about reconfiguring and lightening the engine for use in an airship. But one of the concerns he had was the possible level of vibration the motor would cause, as he had experienced this while driving the tricycle. To test this, he and 2 workmen snuck it into the Bois de Boulogne in the dead of night, hoisted it on ropes slung over a hefty tree branch, and he rode it with the engine on full, dangling a few feet above the ground. There were vibrations, but far fewer than he'd felt on the ground. The engine would work for his airship. Alberto, as ever, brought his own ideas to the design of the airship's envelope. Again intending to use Japanese silk, his design was a thin cigar shape 25 meters long and 3.5 meters in diameter, with the engine mounted on the basket, which was itself directly attached to the envelope by cords, dispensing with what Alberto called the chemise, as had been used on other airships and balloons, basically a heavy netting that goes over the main envelope and secures the gondola, but at the cost of significant weight. Michel Lechambre, as he had done with the balloon Brazil at first, refused to construct it. As Alberto recollects, he would not make himself a party to such rashness. But Alberto mollified him and, perhaps more importantly, agreed to indemnify him against anything that might go wrong. By the 18th of September, just 2 months after his ascent in the Brazil, he was ready to take number 1 for its first flight, inflating the airship in a clearing among trees at the Jardin d'Acclimatation, a zoological garden in Paris. The first flight, or attempt at flight, turned out to be a salutary lesson for Alberto. He had intended to take off into the wind, to give time for the airship to rise above the trees on the far side to a safe altitude. However, the professional aeronauts who had joined the crowd to watch the ascent argued that he risked being dashed against the trees behind him if he did so. Far better to take off like a spherical balloon with the wind. Alberto relented, took off with the wind, and promptly found himself and his airship ensnared in the very trees that he was worried about. The lesson I think he learned was to trust in his own judgment. The airship was only slightly damaged, and 2 days later he was ready for another attempt. This time taking off against the wind and circling the crowd, who applauded as he did so. He found the airship answered its controls well, and he took it higher and higher until it reached a height of 1,300 feet. But there he encountered an inconvenient problem. The air pump he had installed to compensate for the contraction of the hydrogen lifting gas as the airship rose proved itself to be underpowered, and the envelope, no lacking in pressure, began to fold in half and started to plummet towards the earth. Not for the last time, Alberto stared death in the face, and he recalls being excited at the thought of seeing his father again. But as he fell, he noticed a group of boys flying kites on the grassy plain of the Bagatelle Park. He yelled at them to grab the guide rope and run into the wind to give some last-minute lift to the falling airship. They understood exactly what he meant, and their swift actions prevented a very rough landing from being something far worse. Despite this rough landing, Alberto reports that I felt nothing but elation that night. The sentiment of success filled me. I had navigated the air. I had performed every evolution prescribed by the problem. The breakdown itself had not been due to any cause foreseen by the professional aeronauts. And that last sentence is italicized in his memoirs. Paul Hoffman relates that Alberto celebrated that evening with dinner at Maxim's, the legendary fin de siècle Parisian restaurant at which he had a reserved table and whose chefs would provide him with his famous aerial lunches. And we'll pick up with his next efforts after the break. Within months, Alberto was working on number 2, a slightly larger version of number 1 equipped with a better air pump and an internal ballonnet, but still using number 1's basket and engine, and by May 1899 he was ready for the first flight. The morning of 11th of May was pleasant enough, but the rain swept in, and the weather grew worse throughout the day. Alberto at that time did not have his own hangar. He was still inflating his airships in the grounds of the Jardin d'Acclimatation, and sadly, I cannot find any record of how the animals in that zoological park reacted. And this was a lengthy and not inexpensive process. Alberto found himself with a fully inflated airship, an expectant and eager crowd, but with poor weather. There are quite a few examples of airship captains faced with a similar choice, and whenever they decided to chance it and to fly, to hope that they'd be able to overcome the weather, they usually ended up regretting it. And we'll talk about Hugo Eckener's first flight as pilot in command on a future episode. Alberto decided to risk it, and he too regretted the decision. As with number 1, as the airship rose, the hydrogen contracted, causing the airship to lose its shape and again to double up. A strong gust of wind compounded the problem, and the airship fell into nearby trees, with fortunately no injury to Alberto. He reports that after the crash, his friends begged him to give up his experiments, saying, "This time you have learned your lesson. You must understand that it is impossible to keep the shape of your cylindrical balloon rigid. You must not risk your life by taking a petroleum motor up beneath it." You can imagine how Alberto reacted to that advice. He realized that the long, thin shape of his airships made them vulnerable to changes in pressure. Number 3 was to be shorter, fatter, and with greater gas capacity, and with the addition of a 33-foot-long bamboo keel of sorts to provide a stiffening effect. Number 3 was also to be inflated not with hydrogen, but with illuminating gas, the same gas that Paris used for its network of street lamps. This freed him from the Jardin d'Acclimatation and allowed him to take off from just about wherever he pleased. He chose Vaugirard, the site of the La Chambre and Moucheron balloon works, and of his first ever balloon ascent, and as far as I can tell now, a completely built-up area of central Paris. And he took off on the 13th of November, 1899. He steered towards the Champ de Mars, the park at the foot of the Eiffel Tower, where he circled the tower itself a few times, and then headed towards the Parc des Princes, where he had intended to land. But he was enjoying the flight so much he turned to the north and ultimately landed at the Bagatelle, almost exactly at the spot where the kite-flying boys had saved his bacon in number 1. It was a highly successful flight, and Alberto sensed that he was making progress with his designs. Number 3 had flown well, it was stable, and it lost very little gas during the flight. Alberto later wrote, "I no longer had the slightest doubt of the success of my invention. I foresaw that I was going into airship construction as a sort of life work. I should need my own workshop, my own balloon house, hydrogen plant, and connection with the illuminating gas mains." He flew number 3 many times while he built a hangar on land owned by the influential Paris Aero Club at St. Cloud. It seems to have been a successful and fun airship. Alberto once made a flight of 23 hours and flew almost every day in an attempt to demonstrate the reliability of his aircraft. On his last flight in number 3, he lost his rudder and had to make an emergency landing. He would likely have repaired the airship, but found his attention irresistibly drawn to a new challenge laid down by a prominent member of the Paris Aero Club. In rising to this challenge, Alberto was himself to rise from being a local celebrity to becoming one of the most famous men in the world. Henri Doinch de la Meurthe was a successful businessman known as the Oil King of Europe. Through his petroleum business, he became, like Alberto, interested first in automobiles and then aviation. In 1898, he and others, including the author Jules Verne, founded the Aero Club of France to promote aviation, and in April 1900, Doinch laid down his now famous challenge to the would-be aviators of the world. He would award a prize of 100,000 francs to the pilot of any aircraft who could take off from the Aero Club's premises at St. Cloud, fly around the Eiffel Tower, and return in a maximum of 30 minutes. Doinch offered several windows of time in which these flights could take place, being May to October in 1900, 1901, 1902, 1903, or 1904. And Doinch promised that if the prize was not claimed in a given year, he would award the interest to the aviator who had made the most progress that year. Alberto, although he was itching to have a crack at the prize, foresaw a number of problems with the conditions attached. He was especially concerned about the 30-minute time limit. He worried about the stipulation that the judges had to be notified 24 hours in advance of any attempt to win the prize, thinking that the weather conditions may have changed considerably between the time the judges were notified and the time of the flight itself. He worried that pilots would feel a moral pressure to go ahead with flights, the same pressure he himself had succumbed to previously. He also felt a duty of courtesy not to call the judges out at the time of day when conditions were best for flying, which is the crack of dawn, saying that the duelist may call out his friends at that sacred hour, but not the airship captain. Nevertheless, he pursued the prize with single-minded determination. Number 3 was too slow, so it was discarded, as eventually was Number 4, his most recent airship and one with a rather unusual and precarious design. He had discarded the wicker basket used on his previous ships and essentially sat on a bicycle saddle attached to the 33-foot bamboo pole he had used on Number 3. However, he made a number of test flights in Number 4 in 1900, including one in front of the Deutsch Prize judges, enough to be awarded the 1900 Encouragement Prize, amounting to some 4,000 francs. Pointedly, and given his previous objections to the conditions of the Deutsch Prize, he refused to take ownership of the 4,000 francs and asked that the Aero Club retain it as the Santos-Dumont Prize, the parameters of which were very similar to the Deutsche Prize, but with none of the conditions he found so objectionable. He ruled himself out of contention for actually winning it, and it was never in fact claimed. He built a new ship, the Number 5, which used the longer envelope of the Number 4, holding up a brand new wooden keel, 80 metres long, and housing the basket engine and propeller at the rear. In this airship, he would both experience success and his most serious public failure to date. The success came on the 12th of July 1901. Alberto took Number 5 up at 4:30 in the morning. Circling the Longchamp racecourse 10 times, he decided to head for the Eiffel Tower, shrouded in summer morning mist and not visible from his airship. After a brief stop at the Trocadero Gardens to repair a rudder cable, he found the Eiffel Tower, rounded it, and returned to Longchamp, in fact filling the conditions of his own prize. Emboldened by his success, Alberto decided to have a crack at the Deutsch Prize itself, and duly gave the 24 hours notice to the judges of the Aero Club. That July was especially hot in Paris, and Paul Hoffman in Wings of Madness relates how the committee assembled at 6:30 on the morning of the 13th, sweating through their finery. Henri Deutsch himself was present, and although not Alberto's number 1 fan, after his very public criticism of the Deutsch Prize conditions, he wished him all the best. The flight started well. Thanks to a strong tailwind, Alberto rounded the Eiffel Tower in 10 minutes, giving him a full 20 to return to his starting point and thus claim the prize. But it was not to be. The tailwind that had propelled him so swiftly to the tower was now a strong headwind, and it took him 40 minutes to reach St. Cloud, and then, adding insult to injury, his motor failed. Drifting slowly to earth, Number 5 came to rest in a chestnut tree in the garden of Edmund de Rothschild, who sent him up a bottle of champagne to soothe his nerves. Monsieur de Rothschild's neighbour happened to be the Countess d'O, the daughter of the last emperor of Brazil. She dispatched her servants with a lunch for Alberto, who enjoyed it in the basket as he supervised the freeing of his airship from the Rothschild's trees. A few days later, the Countess sent him a medal of St. Benedict to protect him against accidents, which he wore on a little gold bracelet. Despite the rough landing, Alberto was pleased at the airship's performance, and after a few more test flights, he felt confident enough to make another attempt at the Deutsch Prize. The judges were called out again at 6:30 on the 8th of August, and he set off again for the tower, rounding it this time in a mere 9 minutes. From the ground, it must have seemed like victory was in his grasp, but all was not well with Number 5. Alberto noticed the airship was losing hydrogen, the envelope shrinking visibly and causing the piano wires that held it to the wooden keel to sag and then to become entangled in the motor. Alberto instantly stopped the engine. To do otherwise would have been to risk the suspension wires being cut and for the keel to become detached from the envelope and fall, Alberto and all, to the earth. It would be certain death. But now number 5 was marooned in the air, with no engine, rapidly leaking hydrogen, and a crumpling envelope. It was the riskiest situation of Alberto's aviation career, and he describes the jeopardy. The half-empty balloon, fluttering its empty end as an elephant waves its trunk, caused the airship's stem to point upward at an alarming angle. What I most feared, therefore, was that the unequal strain on the suspension wires would break them one by one and so precipitate me to the ground. Precipitate me to the ground, a delicate turn of phrase for what would surely have been a rather awful death. 2,000 feet above the ground, Alberto climbed out of the basket and edged along the flimsy wooden keel back towards the stern, where he worked to free the suspension lines from the propeller, watched in horror by those on the ground, some of whom turned away for fear that they'd see him fall. Number 5 itself fell faster and faster toward the ground, with Alberto now back in the basket. He was very close to the Eiffel Tower, and at one point thought he might actually crash into it, but the will propelled him towards the Seine, which would have been a more welcome landing spot. As it was, the end of the airship's envelope smacked down hard on the roof of the Trocadero Hotel and burst. Alberto describes the sound as exactly like that of a paper bag struck just after being blown up. He describes hanging in the wicker basket. High up in the courtyard of the Trocadero Hotel, supported by my airship's keel that stood braced at an angle of about 45 degrees between the courtyard wall above and the roof of a lower construction farther down. The keel, in spite of my weight, that of the motor and machinery, and the shock it had received in falling, resisted wonderfully. The thin pine scantlings and piano wires of Nice had saved my life. Eventually, the fire department arrived with a rope to haul him to safety, and then set about rescuing the airship itself. Henri Deutsch had rushed to the Trocadero in tears and begged Alberto to accept the prize now, rather than go on risking his life attempting to win it. Naturally, Alberto refused, and Deutsch doubted that his prize would ever be won. Undaunted by his ordeal, Alberto laid out the specifications for airship number 6 that very evening. This time he paid great attention to the valves and pumps that helped the envelope maintain its shape and rigidity. He was able to use the keel, the basket, and the engine salvaged from number 5. Number 6 was a little shorter, but slightly fatter. He tested the airship through September 1901, and despite a couple of minor accidents, felt ready in October to make another attempt at winning the Deutsche Prize. At 2:42, on the afternoon of 19th of October 1901, Alberto Santos-Dumont took off from Longchamp and headed with a tailwind towards the Eiffel Tower, gradually gaining altitude until he rounded the tower some 10 meters above its summit, heading back towards the starting point with 21 of the maximum 30 minutes still remaining. Alberto was now flying into a headwind, which slowed him down, and to make matters worse, his motor kept failing. 3 times it failed, and 3 times he had to let go the steering wheel to tend to it. Engine repaired, he powered towards the finish line at a height of 150 meters. He crossed with a mere 30 seconds left on the clock. Turning the airship and bringing it into land, Alberto, who had no idea of his time, called down to the crowd, "Have I won?" "Yes," they called back. Jubilant, he landed the airship and dismounted, straight into an enormous controversy. And on that tantalizing cliffhanger, we leave Alberto Santos-Dumont possibly poised at the moment of triumph. We'll pick up his story next time, and we'll look at the rest of his career as he continued to develop airships before moving on to heavier-than-air aircraft. Do remember to sign up to the Patreon at www.patreon.com/upshippod. You can email the podcast at upshippodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at upshippod. I hope you enjoyed your flight with us today. Thank you again for listening. Please remember to like, subscribe, and review, and join me next time for more aerial adventures on Upship, the Airship History Podcast.